The gunshot split the desert air like thunder, and Victoria Hayes threw herself to the floor of the stagecoach as bandits surrounded them on all sides. She pressed her face against the rough wooden floorboards, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The driver's panicked shouts mixed with the harsh commands of the outlaws, and through the window she could see dust kicking up from the horses' hooves as they circled like vultures. This was not how she had imagined her journey to Montezuma, New Mexico, would go. She had left Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, her trunk packed with carefully folded wedding dresses and hope for a new life with Thomas Whitmore, the banker she had agreed to marry through their carefully written correspondence over the past year. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, throwing Victoria against the side panel. Her bonnet had come loose and auburn hair spilled across her shoulders. The other passengers, an elderly couple and a merchant, huddled together opposite her, their faces pale with terror. "Everyone out," a gruff voice commanded from outside. "And bring whatever valuables you got." Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle. The merchant moved first, stepping down with his hands raised. The elderly woman whimpered as her husband helped her to her feet. Victoria followed, squinting against the brilliant New Mexico sun. It was July of 1878, and the heat was merciless. 6 men on horseback formed a semicircle around the coach. Their faces were covered with bandanas, and revolvers gleamed in their hands. The driver sat rigid on his perch, hands raised, while the shotgun guard lay slumped beside him, blood seeping through his shirt. "Jewelry, money, watches," the leader barked. He was a broad-shouldered man on a paint horse, his eyes cold above his bandana. "Hand it all over and nobody else gets hurt." Victoria's fingers moved automatically to the locket at her throat, her mother's locket, the only piece of her she had left. The elderly woman was already sobbing, pulling rings from her fingers. "You, the pretty one," the leader said, gesturing at Victoria with his pistol. "That locket, take it off. Please," Victoria heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. "It was my mother's. She passed when I was 16. It has no monetary value, just a lock of her hair inside." The outlaw laughed, a harsh sound. "That gold chain's got value enough. Hand it over or I'll take it myself." Victoria's fingers closed protectively around the locket. She knew she should comply, knew resistance was foolish, but the thought of losing this last piece of her mother made her stubborn. "No." The leader urged his horse forward, and Victoria stood her ground even as her knees threatened to buckle. He reached down toward her neck, and she stumbled backward. The rifle shot came from the rocky outcropping to the east, kicking up dirt at the paint horse's feet. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider, and suddenly the air filled with more gunfire. The bandits scattered, wheeling their horses around to face this new threat. Victoria hit the ground again, covering her head with her arms. Through the chaos, she saw a rider coming fast down the hillside, rifle in one hand, reins in the other. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a dusty brown hat and a bandana around his neck. His horse was a powerful chestnut stallion that moved like liquid fire. The newcomer fired again, and one of the bandits yelped, clutching his arm. Another shot took the hat clean off a second outlaw. The rider reached the stagecoach in a cloud of dust, positioning himself between Victoria and the bandits. "U.S. Marshal," he shouted. "Drop your weapons or the next shots won't be warnings." The bandits hesitated for only a moment. Their leader cursed, wheeling his paint horse around. "This ain't over," he shouted, and then they were thundering away across the desert, leaving their would-be victims in stunned silence. The marshal dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with authority. He was younger than Victoria had first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and eyes the color of steel. A badge gleamed on his vest. "Everyone all right?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of a southern drawl. The elderly couple nodded shakily. The merchant was checking himself over for injuries. The driver climbed down to check on his wounded guard. "He needs a doctor," the driver called out. The marshal moved quickly to assess the injury. "Bullet went clean through his shoulder. We need to get him to Montezuma. It is about 5 miles ahead. Can you drive with him in the coach?" "Yes, sir, Marshal." Only then did the marshal turn his full attention to Victoria, who was still sitting in the dirt, her dress covered in dust, her hair a wild mess around her shoulders. He extended a hand to her. "Miss, are you injured?" Victoria looked up at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift in her chest. His face was sun-bronzed and handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw and eyes that held both intensity and kindness. She placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip as he pulled her effortlessly to her feet. "I'm unharmed," she managed. "Thank you. You saved us." He held her hand a moment longer than necessary, then seemed to realize it and let go, taking a step back. "Just doing my job, miss. Marshal Maddox Abbott at your service. Victoria Hayes," she said, brushing ineffectually at her ruined dress. "I'm traveling to Montezuma, to marry Thomas Whitmore, I expect." When she looked at him in surprise, he offered a small smile. "Small town. Word gets around when the banker's sending for a bride from back east." Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "Yes, I'm his intended." Something flickered across Maddox's face, too quick to read, then he was all business again. "We should get moving. That gang won't go far, and I want everyone safe in town before they consider doubling back." The next 30 minutes were a flurry of activity. The wounded guard was made as comfortable as possible inside the coach. The elderly couple insisted Victoria sit with them, while Maddox tied his stallion to the back of the stagecoach and rode up top with the driver, his rifle across his knees, alert for any sign of the bandits' return. Victoria found herself unable to stop thinking about the marshal. The way he had appeared like something out of a dime novel, fearless and skilled. The way his eyes had held hers. She pressed her hand against her mother's locket, grateful it was still hanging around her neck, and tried to think of Thomas instead. Her betrothed. The man she was traveling across the country to marry. She had Thomas's letters memorized. He wrote beautifully about the opportunities in New Mexico territory, about building a life together, about the fine house he had prepared for her. He had seemed kind and educated in his correspondence, promising to provide well for her. After her father's death had left her with little means and few prospects in Philadelphia, Thomas's proposal had seemed like Providence itself. But Thomas had never ridden to her rescue with gunfire and courage. Thomas had never looked at her with those intense steel-gray eyes. Victoria shook her head, disturbed by her own thoughts. She was being foolish. Marshal Abbott had simply been performing his duty. She was tired and shaken from the attack, that was all. Once she reached Montezuma and met Thomas properly, these silly notions would disappear. The town came into view as they crested a rise. Montezuma was smaller than Victoria had imagined, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures arranged along a main street. The San Felipe Hotel dominated one end, a 2-story building that looked almost grand compared to its neighbors. There was a general store, a saloon, a church, and various other establishments she could not quite make out from this distance. As they rolled down the main street, people emerged from doorways and storefronts, watching their arrival. The driver pulled up in front of a building with a sign reading Dr. Samuel Pierce, physician. Maddox jumped down and immediately began coordinating the guard's transfer to the doctor's care. Victoria stepped out of the coach, grateful to be on solid ground again, even if her legs felt unsteady. Victoria! She turned to see a man hurrying toward her from the direction of a neat brick building with Montezuma Bank and Trust painted on its window. He was of medium height, perhaps in his early 30s, with thinning blonde hair and a well-tailored suit that looked out of place in this dusty frontier town. His face was pleasant enough, with pale blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Thomas, Victoria said, and he was upon her, taking both her hands in his. "My dear, I heard there was trouble on the road. Thank heavens you are safe." His hands were soft, she noticed, banker's hands. He smelled of bay rum and had a small spot of ink on his collar. "I'm quite well," Victoria assured him. Marshal Abbott arrived in time. Thomas glanced over at where Maddox was speaking with the doctor. "Yes, our Marshal is quite the hero, isn't he? Always in the thick of danger." There was something in his tone Victoria could not quite place, not quite admiration, not quite resentment. "He saved our lives," Victoria said firmly. Of course, of course." Thomas patted her hands. "You must be exhausted from your journey. I have a room prepared for you at the hotel. We will have time to get properly acquainted before the wedding. I thought perhaps Saturday next, if that suits you." Reverend Morrison can perform the ceremony. Saturday. That was less than 2 weeks away. Victoria had known the wedding would be soon after her arrival, but hearing it stated so plainly made it suddenly very real. "That sounds fine," she heard herself say. Thomas beamed. "Wonderful. Let me help you with your trunk. I'll see you settled at the hotel, and perhaps you would join me for dinner this evening. The hotel dining room serves a surprisingly good roast." As Thomas went to retrieve her trunk, Victoria found herself looking back at Maddox. He was watching her, she realized, though he looked away the moment their eyes met. He said something to the doctor, tipped his hat to the elderly couple, and then mounted his chestnut stallion with easy grace. He rode past the hotel as Thomas was leading Victoria inside, and for just a moment, their eyes met again. Then he was gone, riding toward what she assumed was the marshal's office. The hotel room was simple but clean, with a bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the main street. Thomas left her to freshen up, promising to return in 2 hours for dinner. Victoria unpinned her ruined hat and poured water from the pitcher into the basin. She caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand and was startled by her own appearance. Her hair was tangled, her face smudged with dirt, her dress beyond saving. But her eyes were bright, almost feverish, and her cheeks were flushed. She touched her mother's locket again and thought about what her mother would say if she were here. Her mother had married for love, a passionate romance that had scandalized her family. She had always told Victoria to listen to her heart, but Victoria's heart had led her here, hadn't it? She had chosen to answer Thomas's advertisement, chosen to travel west, chosen this new life. Whatever she was feeling about the Marshal was just the drama of the rescue, the natural gratitude towards someone who had saved her life. By the time Thomas returned, Victoria had managed to make herself presentable in one of the dresses from her trunk, a simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes. She had tamed her hair into a respectable bun and washed away the dust of the trail. Thomas offered his arm, and they descended to the hotel dining room. It was a modest space with perhaps a dozen tables, most of them occupied by men who looked like ranchers or merchants. A few women sat scattered among them, and all eyes turned to watch as Thomas led Victoria to a table by the window. "Everyone is naturally curious about you," Thomas said as he held her chair. "We don't get many newcomers, and certainly not anyone so lovely." Victoria smiled politely and allowed him to order for both of them. As they waited for their food, Thomas talked about the bank, about the town's growth, about the fine future they would build together. He was articulate and clearly intelligent, and Victoria tried very hard to focus on his words. "You'll find Montezuma quite civilized, despite being in the territory," Thomas was saying. "We have a lending library and the church hosts social events. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife in Santa Fe, has promised to visit once you are settled. You'll find the society quite pleasant." "It sounds wonderful," Victoria said, and meant it. This was what she had come for after all: security, respectability, a comfortable life. The door to the dining room opened and Maddox Abbott walked in. He had cleaned up since the afternoon, though he still wore his marshal's badge and his gun belt. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and scanned the room. When his eyes landed on Victoria, he hesitated, then nodded politely before taking a seat at the bar. "The Marshal dines here most evenings," Thomas said, following her gaze. "He rooms above the jail, which apparently lacks adequate cooking facilities." "He seems very dedicated to his work," Victoria offered. Thomas made a non-committal sound. "Oh, Maddox takes his duties very seriously." "Perhaps too seriously. He's been after that Donovan gang for months now. The men who attacked your stage, I would wager. They've been hitting coaches and freight wagons all through the territory." "Donovan?" Victoria asked. "Jack Donovan, the leader. Nasty piece of work." Thomas lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I think Maddox is a bit obsessed. A lawman should know when to let federal authorities handle such matters. It isn't safe, riding after desperados alone." Victoria glanced over at Maddox again. He was speaking with the bartender, accepting a plate of food. There was a weariness to him she had not noticed before, visible now in the way his shoulders curved slightly forward, the shadows under his eyes. Their food arrived, and Victoria forced her attention back to Thomas. He was describing the house he had prepared for her, a neat cottage on the edge of town with a garden and a view of the mountains. It sounded charming. Thomas himself seemed perfectly pleasant. He had good manners, clear prospects, and had been nothing but courteous to her. So why did her gaze keep drifting back to the Marshal at the bar? After dinner, Thomas walked her back upstairs to her room, stopping decorously at her door. "I hope you sleep well, my dear. Tomorrow I'll show you around the town properly and you can meet some of the other ladies. Mrs. Chen, who runs the general store, is particularly kind. I think you'll find friends here." "Thank you, Thomas. You've been very thoughtful." He took her hand and kissed it gently. "I want you to be happy here, Victoria. I know this is all very new and strange, but I hope in time you'll come to feel at home in Montezuma." After he left, Victoria prepared for bed but found sleep elusive. She stood at her window, looking out at the darkened street. A few buildings still showed lamplight, including the Marshal's office. She could see Maddox's silhouette moving past the window, and she wondered what kept him awake. The next morning, Victoria woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through her window. She dressed in a practical cotton dress suitable for meeting the townspeople and went down to breakfast. Thomas had promised to call for her at 9. The dining room was quieter in the morning, occupied by a few travelers and local merchants. Victoria was finishing her coffee when she heard raised voices from the street. She moved to the window and saw a small crowd gathering near the Marshal's office. Concerned, she left the dining room and stepped out onto the hotel's front porch. The crowd was growing, perhaps 15 or 20 people now, and she could hear Maddox's voice, calm but firm, trying to restore order. Victoria's curiosity overcame her propriety, and she walked closer. As she approached, she could make out what the shouting was about. "They hit the Miller Ranch last night," an older man in rancher's clothing was saying. "Took every horse in the stable, roughed up Miller's son when he tried to stop them. This has got to end, Marshal." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Garrett," Maddox said. "I'm organizing a posse to ride out today." "A posse?" Another man spat into the dust. "We need the army, not a posse. That Donovan gang is too big for one lawman to handle." "The army has jurisdiction issues," Maddox said patiently, "but I've sent word to the territorial marshal. Until help arrives, I'm not going to sit idle while they terrorize this county." "You are going to get yourself killed," Mr. Garrett said, but his tone had softened. "You are a good lawman, Abbott, too good to throw your life away on a suicide mission." "I don't intend to get killed," Maddox replied with a slight smile. "I intend to bring them in. Now, who's willing to ride with me?" Several hands went up, though Victoria noticed many men looked away or found sudden interest in their boots. She could not blame them. They had families, businesses, lives to protect. Chasing outlaws was not their responsibility. Maddox nodded at the volunteers, perhaps 6 men in all. "Get your horses and provisions. We leave in 1 hour. I want to track them while the trail's fresh." The crowd began to disperse and Maddox turned back toward his office. He saw Victoria standing there and paused. "Miss Hayes, you shouldn't be out here." "I heard the commotion," she said. "Is it the same gang from yesterday? Likely. They're getting bolder." He studied her face. "You look troubled." Victoria was not sure what possessed her to speak her mind. "Mr. Garrett is right. It sounds dangerous." Something in Maddox's expression softened. "It's my job, Miss Hayes. These people deserve to feel safe in their homes. But do you have to do it alone?" "I have volunteers." 6 men against how many outlaws? Maddox smiled, and it transformed his face, chasing away the weariness. "Your concern is noted, but I've been doing this job for 3 years now. I know how to handle myself." 3 years isn't very long," Victoria said before she could stop herself. "Long enough to learn the country and the men who prey on it." He tilted his head, studying her. "You should get back to the hotel, Miss Hayes. I imagine your intended will be looking for you." It was a gentle dismissal, and Victoria felt her cheeks heat. "Of course, please be careful, Marshal." "Maddox," he said quietly. "You can call me Maddox." "Victoria," she replied just as quietly. They stood there for a moment, the morning sun warming them, dust motes dancing in the air between them. Then Thomas's voice called out, "Victoria, there you are. I was concerned when you weren't at the hotel." Victoria turned to see Thomas hurrying toward them, his face creased with worry. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I heard the commotion and wanted to see what was happening." Thomas reached her side and took her arm, a bit more possessively than necessary. "The marshal was just explaining about last night's raid at the Miller Ranch. Terrible business. But nothing for you to worry yourself over." "I don't think Victoria is the worrying type," Maddox said mildly. "She stood up to an armed outlaw yesterday over her mother's locket." Thomas looked at her in surprise. "You did what?" "It was foolish," Victoria admitted. "But the marshal arrived before anything happened." "Lucky timing," Thomas said stiffly. "Or good tracking," Maddox replied. "I'd been following signs of the Donovan gang for 2 days. I knew they were in the area." The 2 men looked at each other, and Victoria sensed something unsaid passing between them, some history or friction she did not understand. "Well, we're grateful for your service as always, Marshal," Thomas said formally. "Come, Victoria, I want to introduce you to Mrs. Chen and some of the other merchants." Victoria allowed herself to be led away, but she looked back once. Maddox was watching them go, his expression unreadable. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of introductions. Mrs. Chen, who ran the general store with her husband, was indeed kind. a tiny woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile. She insisted Victoria call her Lily and promised to help her shop for any household items she might need after the wedding. They visited the church, where Reverend Morrison greeted them with enthusiasm, already talking about the marriage ceremony. They met the school teacher, Miss Parsons, a severe-looking woman who nevertheless had intelligent eyes. They stopped by the dressmaker's shop, where Mrs. O'Malley, a plump woman with Irish red hair going gray, exclaimed over Victoria's wedding dress and promised to let out any seams that needed adjusting after the long journey. Everyone was welcoming, if curious. Victoria could see the questions in their eyes. Why would a pretty young woman from Philadelphia come all this way to marry Thomas Whitmore? What was wrong with her that she could not find a husband back east? The answers were complicated. Her father's death from pneumonia 2 years ago had left her nearly penniless. His business partner had absconded with most of his assets, leaving Victoria with only enough money to rent a small room in a boarding house and work as a seamstress. It was a hard, lonely life with no prospects for improvement. When her friend Sarah had shown her Thomas's advertisement in the newspaper, it had seemed like a sign. A respectable banker seeking a cultured wife, promising a comfortable home and social position. Victoria had written to him that very day. Now, walking through Montezuma on Thomas's arm, she tried to convince herself she had made the right choice. The town was growing. The people seemed decent. Thomas was clearly respected here. She could build a good life. But when they passed the marshal's office and saw Maddox riding out with his small posse, rifles across their saddles and determination on their faces, Victoria felt her heart clench with an emotion she did not want to examine too closely. That evening, Thomas took her to dine at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, the mayor and his wife. The Hendersons lived in one of the nicest houses in town, a 2-story adobe with glass windows and real carpets. Mrs. Henderson was a formidable woman in her 50s, who clearly ran both her household and, Victoria suspected, much of the town's social life. "We are so pleased to have you here, my dear," Mrs. Henderson said as they sat down to dinner. "Fresh blood is exactly what this town needs. Too many rough men and not enough civilizing influences." "I hope I can contribute to the community," Victoria said politely. "Oh, you will, you will. I've already spoken to Reverend Morrison about starting a proper ladies' auxiliary. We need to raise funds for a new church bell, and I think a series of socials would be just the thing." Mr. Henderson, a portly man who said little, nodded along with his wife's pronouncements. Thomas seemed pleased with how well Victoria was fitting in. But Victoria's mind kept wandering to the desert, to Maddox and his men tracking dangerous outlaws in the dark. Had they found the gang's trail? Were they safe? "Don't you think, Victoria?" Mrs. Henderson was saying. Victoria realized she had missed the question entirely. "I'm sorry, I was distracted. Could you repeat that?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed slightly. "I was saying that the marshal really should settle down. A man of his position needs a wife to keep him grounded. All this riding around after criminals, it's not proper for a man approaching 30. "The marshal is dedicated to his duty," Victoria said, and heard the defensive edge in her own voice. Thomas laughed lightly. "Victoria met Maddox under rather dramatic circumstances yesterday. He does make quite the impression during a rescue." "Oh, my dear, you mustn't let yourself be swayed by such theatrics," Mrs. Henderson said with a knowing look. "Maddox Abbott is thrilling, I'll grant you, but he's hardly husband material. Too restless, too focused on danger. You've made the much wiser choice with Thomas. Stability is vastly underrated by young women." Victoria wanted to argue to defend Maddox, but she could not quite articulate why. Mrs. Henderson was probably right. What kind of life could a marshal's wife expect? Constant worry, long absences, the ever-present threat of violence. And yet, the dinner continued, and Victoria played her part, smiling and nodding in all the right places. But a part of her was riding through the desert darkness, following a trail only visible to those who knew how to look. 3 days passed. Maddox and his posse had not returned. Victoria tried to settle into her new life, spending time with the ladies of the town, finalizing wedding preparations, getting to know Thomas better. He was unfailingly courteous, bringing her flowers from the garden behind his house, taking her on walks through town, telling her about his work at the bank. But there was something missing. No spark, no connection beyond pleasant companionship. When Thomas held her hand, she felt nothing but the warmth of his palm. When he spoke, she listened but felt no deep curiosity to know his thoughts. It was all perfectly nice and perfectly empty. On the 4th day, Victoria was in the general store with Lily Chen, selecting fabric for curtains, when the sound of horses drew everyone to the windows. The posse was returning, riding slowly down the main street. Victoria's heart leaped, then plummeted as she counted only 5 horses instead of 7. She rushed outside with the other townspeople. Maddox was in the lead, his face grim beneath days of trail dust. Behind him rode the other men, 2 of them supporting a wounded companion. But Victoria could see they were 1 man short. "Jimmy Pearson didn't make it," someone in the crowd said quietly. "Damn shame. He had 3 kids." Maddox dismounted, moving stiffly as though he was injured himself, though Victoria could see no obvious wound. The doctor rushed forward to help with the wounded man. "Did you get them?" Mr. Garrett asked. Maddox shook his head. "They split up. We followed one group, caught 2 of them. The others got away across the border into Mexico. I've sent word to the authorities there, but I don't hold much hope." "2 out of how many?" someone else asked. "At least 10 in the full gang," Maddox said. His voice was rough with exhaustion. "But it's something. Those 2 will stand trial." "Jimmy Pearson paid a hell of a price for 2 outlaws," a woman's voice called out bitterly. Maddox's face seemed to age 10 years. "Yes, madam, he did. I'll be paying a visit to Mrs. Pearson shortly." The crowd dispersed slowly, the mood somber. Victoria found herself walking toward Maddox without conscious thought. He was speaking with one of his deputies, giving instructions about the prisoners when she reached him. "Marshal Abbott," she said softly. He turned, and up close she could see the toll the past 4 days had taken. There was a fresh cut above his eyebrow, bruises on his knuckles, and his eyes were haunted. "Miss Hayes." His voice was flat, exhausted. "I'm sorry about Mr. Pearson." Maddox nodded once sharply, and Victoria saw him swallow hard. "I need to see his widow, explain what happened." "Is there anything I can do?" "Unless you can bring Jimmy back, I don't see how." The words were harsh, but Victoria heard the pain beneath them. "You're injured, just bruised, nothing serious. You should see the doctor." "The doctor's busy with men who need him more than I do." Maddox took a breath, seemed to gather himself. "I apologize, Miss Hayes. That was uncalled for. I'm tired and not fit company." Before Victoria could respond, Thomas appeared at her elbow. "Victoria, you shouldn't bother the marshal when he's clearly had a difficult time." "She's not bothering me," Maddox said quietly. "Nevertheless, I'm sure you have duties to attend to." Thomas's voice was polite but firm. "Victoria, I was hoping we could finalize the arrangements with the Reverend this afternoon." Victoria wanted to refuse to stay and talk to Maddox, to offer some comfort even though she had no idea how. But Thomas was right. It was not her place. She was Thomas's intended, not Maddox's friend. "Of course," she said. "Marshal, please take care of yourself." Maddox tipped his hat to her, already turning back to his deputy. "Madam." That evening, unable to sleep, Victoria sat by her window watching the lights in the marshal's office. She could see Maddox's shadow moving back and forth, pacing like a caged animal. She wondered if he was thinking about Jimmy Pearson, about the man's widow and children. She wondered if he blamed himself. The next day was Sunday, and the whole town turned out for services. Victoria sat beside Thomas in one of the front pews, very aware that this would be her spot every Sunday after they married. The banker's wife, respectable and proper. The Pearson family sat across the aisle, Mrs. Pearson in black, her 3 children beside her. The youngest could not have been more than 4. Maddox sat in the very back, alone, his hat in his hands. Reverend Morrison spoke about sacrifice and duty, about the price of civilization in wild country. Victoria thought it was probably meant to be comforting, but from the set of Maddox's shoulders, she could see it was having the opposite effect. After the service, the townspeople gathered outside. Mrs. Pearson approached Maddox, and Victoria watched him brace himself as if expecting a blow. But the widow simply took his hand. "Jimmy knew the risks," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet morning. "He chose to ride with you because he believed in what you are doing. Don't you dishonor his choice by carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry." Maddox's throat worked. "Madam, you brought him home," Mrs. Pearson said firmly. "You didn't leave him out there, that matters. That matters to me and to his children. Thank you, Marshal." She walked away, her children following, leaving Maddox standing there looking as though he had been struck. Victoria saw him take a deep breath, saw him square his shoulders and put his hat back on. Then he walked away toward his office, declining all offers of Sunday dinner. "That woman is stronger than most men I know," Thomas said quietly beside her. Victoria nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The next few days passed in a strange blur. The wedding was now only 5 days away. Victoria's dress was ready. The church was prepared. Mrs. Henderson had organized a reception at the hotel. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. But Victoria felt as though she was watching it all happen to someone else. She smiled and thanked people and made appropriate responses, all while feeling increasingly disconnected from her own life. She saw Maddox only in passing. He was busy with his duties, dealing with the 2 captured outlaws, writing reports, coordinating with the territorial authorities. When their paths crossed on the street, he tipped his hat politely, but there was a distance in his eyes that had not been there before. On Tuesday evening, Thomas took Victoria for a walk to see the house that would be their home. It was indeed charming, a neat cottage with blue shutters and a small garden. Inside, the furniture was simple but well made, the kitchen well equipped. "I hope you'll be happy here," Thomas said, watching her face anxiously. "I know it's not as grand as what you're used to in Philadelphia." "It's lovely," Victoria interrupted, and it was true. It was a perfectly nice house. She could imagine living here, could picture herself cooking in that kitchen, tending that garden, sleeping in that bedroom. What she could not picture was being happy. Thomas took her hands. "Victoria, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Her heart began to race. "Of course. Do you have feelings for Maddox Abbott?" Victoria opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Thomas deserved honesty. "I admire him," she said carefully. "He's a brave man who saved my life. But I came here to marry you, Thomas. I intend to honor that commitment." "That's not what I asked." Thomas's pale blue eyes were kind but sad. "I asked if you have feelings for him." Victoria looked away. "It doesn't matter what I feel. Maddox has shown no particular interest in me, and even if he had, I gave you my word. Your word, but not your heart." The truth of it hung between them. Victoria felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm trying. I truly am trying." Thomas sighed and released her hands. "I know you are, and that's the tragedy of it, isn't it? You're trying so hard to choose the sensible path, the safe path. The path I represent. Is that so wrong?" "No," Thomas said quietly, "but it's not fair to either of us. I want a wife who chooses me because she cannot imagine choosing anyone else, not because I'm the prudent option." "Thomas, let me finish, please." He walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "I've known Maddox for 5 years. He came here after the war, restless and searching for something he couldn't name. He became Marshal because he needed purpose, needed to feel like he was protecting something after failing to protect so much during the war." "What do you mean?" Victoria asked softly. "He was a captain in the Union Army, lost most of his company in an ambush during the final year. He was only 22, and he watched men die under his command. It changed him, the way war changes everyone. He came west to outrun those ghosts." Victoria's heart ached. She thought of the way Maddox had looked after Jimmy Pearson's death, the weight of responsibility he carried. "He's never let himself care about anything but his duty," Thomas continued. "Never courted any of the women in town, never stayed still long enough to build a real life. Until you arrived. He barely knows me." Thomas turned to look at her. "And yet I've seen the way he watches you when he thinks no one is looking. The way he found reasons to walk past the hotel, the way his face changes when your name is mentioned." He paused. "I've also seen the way you watch him." Victoria felt her cheeks burn. "I gave you my word," she repeated. "I know. And you would keep it because you're an honorable woman. You would marry me on Saturday and try your very best to be a good wife. And I would try my very best to make you happy. And we would both fail because your heart would always be somewhere else. So what are you saying?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm saying I release you from our engagement." The words seemed to echo in the small room. Victoria stared at him. "Thomas, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to." He smiled, and it was genuine if sad. "I want someone who loves me, Victoria, who chooses me not because I'm safe or sensible, but because I make her heart race. You deserve that too, and so does Maddox, though God knows he doesn't realize it." Tears spilled down Victoria's cheeks. "You're a good man, Thomas Whitmore." "I am," he agreed with a small laugh. "Which is why I'm not going to keep you tied to a promise that would make us both miserable. But Victoria, you should know Maddox is not an easy man to love. He'll put himself in danger, he'll carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, he'll try to protect you by pushing you away." "I know. Do you? Because it's one thing to admire a man from a distance and another to build a life with him." Victoria thought about this. Thought about the fear she would feel every time Maddox rode out after criminals. The nights she would lie awake wondering if he would come home. The burden of loving someone who lived so close to danger. Then she thought about a life without ever knowing what could have been. A life of wondering and regret. "I need to try," she said. "Even if he doesn't feel the same way, even if nothing comes of it, I need to try." Thomas nodded as though she had confirmed something he already knew. "Then you'd better go talk to him. And Victoria, be patient. He's not used to letting people in." Victoria impulsively kissed Thomas's cheek. "Thank you for understanding, for being kind about this." "Go on before I change my mind," Thomas said with a mock scowl that could not hide his smile. Victoria practically ran back to town. It was nearly dark now, and the main street was quiet. Lights spilled from the saloon and the hotel, but the marshal's office sat dark. Victoria's steps slowed. Where would Maddox be? She tried the office anyway, knocking on the door. No answer. She peered through the window and saw the holding cells empty. The 2 prisoners had been transferred to Santa Fe yesterday for trial. He rides out to the canyon most evenings, a voice said behind her. Victoria turned to find Lily Chen standing there, a basket over her arm. The older woman smiled knowingly. "What canyon?" Victoria asked. "About 2 miles east, there's a spot where the river runs through red rock walls, beautiful at sunset. Maddox goes there when he needs to think." Lily tilted her head. "I take it you and Thomas had a talk." "How did you small town, dear? And I have eyes. That man has been watching you like a starving man watches a feast." She gestured east. "Follow the main road until you see a break in the rocks on the left. There's a trail marked with white stones." Victoria hesitated. "Is it safe for me to ride out alone?" "Safe enough at dusk. The outlaws stick to the high country, but take a lantern for the ride back." Lily reached into her basket and produced a small oil lamp. "Here. I was bringing this to the church, but I think this is a better use for it." "Thank you," Victoria said, taking the lantern. "Thank me by being brave," Lily said. "That man needs someone brave enough to break through his walls." Victoria hurried to the livery stable, where the owner, a grizzled man named Pete, looked surprised to see her. "Need a horse, miss?" "Yes, please. Something gentle." Pete saddled a sweet-tempered mare named Daisy and helped Victoria mount. It had been years since she had ridden, not since childhood summers at her aunt's farm, but the skill came back quickly. The ride east was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The desert was painted in shades of gold and purple by the setting sun, but every shadow could hide danger. Victoria kept Daisy at a steady pace, watching for the break in the rocks Lily had mentioned. She found it just as the last light was fading from the sky. The white stones were clearly visible, marking a trail that led down between towering red rock walls. Victoria could hear water running somewhere below. She dismounted and led Daisy down the trail carefully. The canyon opened up into a hidden space where a small river ran through red stone carved smooth by centuries of water. The last rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls in brilliant orange and red. And there, sitting on a flat rock by the water's edge, was Maddox. His horse was tethered nearby, grazing on the sparse grass. Maddox had removed his hat and his gun belt, and he sat with his arms resting on his knees, staring at the water. Victoria tied Daisy next to the chestnut stallion and walked forward slowly. Maddox must have heard her approach, but he did not turn around. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Miss Hayes," he said quietly. "It's not safe." Lily Chen said it was safe enough. Lily Chen doesn't always know what she's talking about, but there was no heat in his words. "What are you doing here, Victoria?" Her name and his voice made her heart skip. "Looking for you." "Why?" Victoria came around to face him. In the fading light, his face was all shadows and sharp angles. "Because I need to tell you something." "If you're here to invite me to the wedding, that's not necessary. I already know it's Saturday." "There isn't going to be a wedding." That got his attention. His head snapped up, steel gray eyes locking with hers. "What?" "Thomas and I had a conversation. We agreed that we are not suited for each other." Maddox stood slowly. "Did he hurt you?" "Because if he— No, nothing like that. Thomas was a perfect gentleman. He's a good man." "Then why?" "Because neither of us could pretend our hearts were in it." Victoria took a step closer. "Because we both knew I had feelings for someone else." Maddox went very still. "Victoria, don't what? Tell you the truth. Don't throw away security and stability for a foolish infatuation." His voice was rough. "That's all this is. I saved you from danger, and you're confusing gratitude for something more." "I am not confused," Victoria said firmly. "And I am not some delicate flower who doesn't know her own mind. I have feelings for you, Maddox, real feelings. And I think you have them for me too." "It doesn't matter what I feel." "Why not?" "Because I can't offer you anything." The words burst from him like a dam breaking. I can't offer you a safe life or a comfortable home or children who don't have to worry about their father coming home in a pine box. I can't give you any of the things Thomas could have given you. I don't want what Thomas could give me, Victoria said. I want you. Maddox shook his head, backing away. You don't know what you're asking. Every time I ride out, there's a chance I won't come back, like Jimmy Pearson. Like the 15 men who died under my command during the war. People around me get hurt, Victoria. They die. So your solution is to never let anyone close, to spend your whole life alone. It's safer that way. For whom? Victoria challenged. You think you're protecting me by pushing me away, but you're just protecting yourself from the possibility of loss. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. My mother died when I was 16. Pneumonia took her in 3 days. My father died 2 years ago, and his business partner's betrayal nearly left me destitute. I know about loss, Maddox. I know how much it hurts to love people and lose them. She moved closer, close enough to see the silver flecks in his gray eyes. But I also know that a life lived in fear of loss is no life at all. Victoria, her name was almost a groan. Tell me you don't feel anything for me, she said softly. Look me in the eye and tell me honestly that you feel nothing, and I'll walk away right now. I'll leave Montezuma tomorrow and you'll never see me again. Maddox stared at her, his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the river running over stones. I can't, he finally whispered. God help me, I can't tell you that. Victoria's heart soared. Then what can you tell me? That I haven't stopped thinking about you since the moment I saw you on that stagecoach. That every time I close my eyes, I see your face. That the thought of you marrying Thomas was driving me half mad with jealousy. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. That I am terrified of how much I already care about you after knowing you barely a week. Then stop fighting it, Victoria said. She reached up and laid her palm against his cheek. Stop trying to protect me from something I'm choosing with my eyes wide open. What if something happens to me? What if I leave you alone like Jimmy left his wife? Then I'll grieve you, and I'll remember every moment we had together, and I'll be grateful I was brave enough to love you. Her thumb brushed over his cheekbone. But what if nothing happens? What if we have 50 years together? Are you willing to throw that away because you're afraid? Maddox covered her hand with his, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. The gesture was so tender it made Victoria's eyes sting with tears. You deserve better than me, he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. I deserve someone who makes me feel alive, someone I respect and admire, someone whose kiss I've been dreaming about. Victoria smiled up at him. That's you, Maddox Abbott, whether you like it or not. Something in his expression shifted, the last of his walls crumbling. What if I do like it? He asked softly. What if I want nothing more than to kiss you right now? Then I would say you're wasting time talking. Maddox laughed, a real laugh that transformed his entire face. Then he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her. His lips were warm and gentle at first, questioning. Victoria answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with all the pent-up longing of the past week. She felt Maddox make a sound low in his throat, and then he was gathering her closer, deepening the kiss. It was nothing like the chaste pecks she had received from suitors in Philadelphia. This was fire and passion and connection. This was two people who had been dancing around each other finally coming together. Victoria felt it all the way to her toes. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maddox rested his forehead against hers. I'm still going to worry about you every time I ride out, he said. I know. And this job, it's dangerous. There will be nights I don't come home. I know that too. And I'm not easy to live with. I get moody and distant when I'm working through a problem. Victoria laughed. Are you trying to talk me out of this? I'm trying to make sure you know what you're getting into. I know exactly what I'm getting into, Victoria said. She kissed him again, quick and sweet. I'm getting a brave, honorable man who cares too much and tries too hard to protect everyone around him. I'm getting someone who makes me feel more alive in 1 week than I felt in years back in Philadelphia. I'm getting you, Maddox, all of you, and I want every part, even the difficult bits. Maddox held her close, his face buried in her hair. I don't know how to do this. I haven't let myself care about anyone in so long. Then we'll figure it out together. Victoria pulled back to look at him. I'm not expecting perfection. I'm just expecting honesty and effort. I can do that, Maddox said. And Victoria, I'm going to do everything in my power to come home to you every single time. That's all I ask. They stood there in the canyon as full dark fell, holding each other, listening to the river. Finally, Maddox stirred. We should head back before it's completely dark. People will talk if you're out here with me too long. Let them talk, Victoria said. But she let him help her onto Daisy, smiling when he insisted on checking her saddle himself, making sure everything was secure. They rode back to town side by side, not touching but connected by something deeper than physical contact. As they approached Montezuma, Victoria could see lights in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. This place that had been strange and foreign a week ago was starting to feel like home. Maddox insisted on escorting her all the way to the hotel. He helped her dismount and walked her to the front door. I'll call on you tomorrow, he said, properly, with flowers. Victoria smiled. I'd like that. He kissed her once more softly, then stepped back. Good night, Victoria. Good night, Maddox. She watched him lead both horses back to the stable, then floated up to her room on a cloud of happiness. She barely slept that night, too full of joy and possibility to rest. The next morning, the entire town knew that the wedding was off, and that the marshal had been seen kissing Victoria Hayes in the canyon. Small towns being what they were, the news had spread faster than wildfire. Victoria faced it head-on, going down to breakfast with her head held high. Several of the hotel guests stared and one older woman sniffed disapprovingly. But Lily Chen, breakfasting with her husband, gave Victoria a broad wink. Thomas himself appeared mid-morning, finding Victoria in the hotel parlor. I wanted to make sure you were all right, he said. I heard the gossips are busy. I'm fine, Victoria assured him. Thomas, I hope we can still be friends. I never wanted to hurt you. You didn't, Thomas said honestly. You were honest when I asked, and you gave me the chance to make the right choice for both of us. I'm grateful for that. He smiled. And between you and me, I'm already receiving invitations to dinner from several of the local families. Apparently, I'm back on the market, Victoria laughed. Then I hope you find someone who loves you the way you deserve. I hope the same for you. Though it looks like you already have. After Thomas left, Victoria spent the day settling her affairs. She arranged to stay at the hotel indefinitely, using what little money she had left from her journey. She would need to find work, she realized. She could not live on Maddox's marshal's salary, even if they married. She was a skilled seamstress. Perhaps Mrs. O'Malley needed help in her shop. Maddox appeared in the afternoon, looking scrubbed and nervous, with a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. He took her for a walk through town, and if people stared, neither of them cared. I need to be honest with you about my prospects, Maddox said as they walked. I don't have much saved. The marshal's salary is decent but not generous. I have a small house I bought last year, but it needs work. I saw it, Victoria admitted. It's next to Thomas's cottage. I walked past it several times. Maddox stopped walking. You were checking out my house. I was curious, Victoria said, unapologetic. It has good bones. The porch needs repair and the paint is peeling, but the structure is sound." "You were really looking at it, weren't you?" Maddox seemed pleased. "The inside needs even more work. I'm never there long enough to do much beyond sleep." "I could help," Victoria offered. "I'm quite handy with a paintbrush, and I'll need something to do. I'm going to ask Mrs. O'Malley about work in her dress shop." "You don't have to work." "I want to," Victoria said firmly. "I'm not going to be idle, Maddox. I need purpose just as much as you do." He smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You are nothing like what I expected. Is that good or bad?" "It's wonderful." Over the next few weeks, they fell into a pattern. Maddox would call on Victoria in the mornings before his duties began. They would have breakfast together at the hotel, talking about everything and nothing. Victoria learned about his childhood in Tennessee, about the war and its aftermath, about his decision to come west. She told him about her life in Philadelphia, about her parents and her struggle after their deaths. She told him about the fear she had felt accepting Thomas's proposal, knowing she was gambling her entire future on correspondence with a stranger. "I'm glad you're brave," Maddox said one morning. "Brave enough to come west, brave enough to admit when something wasn't right, brave enough to take a chance on me." "You're worth the chance," Victoria said simply. She did get work with Mrs. O'Malley, who was delighted to have skilled help. Victoria spent her days sewing, taking in money that meant she could contribute to her own upkeep. Mrs. O'Malley turned out to be a font of information about the town and its people, and her shop became a gathering place for the local women. Most of them were kind to Victoria, though a few remained standoffish. Mrs. Henderson, in particular, made her disapproval clear. "Running off with the marshal when you were promised to poor Thomas," she sniffed one day when she came in for a fitting. "I expected better from an Eastern woman." "Thomas and I came to a mutual understanding," Victoria said evenly, pins in her mouth as she adjusted Mrs. Henderson's hem. "And he's hardly suffering. I saw him having dinner with the Johnsons' daughter last week." Mrs. Henderson had the grace to look chagrined. "Well, perhaps. But still, the marshal is hardly a stable choice." "He's my choice," Victoria said. "And I'm happy." And she was. Deliriously, completely happy. When Maddox had to ride out on business, she worried, but she also trusted him to come home. When he returned, sometimes bruised and always exhausted, she was there to welcome him back. They spent their evenings working on his house, turning it into a home. Victoria painted walls while Maddox fixed the porch. They planted a small garden together. Lily Chen donated curtains and Mrs. O'Malley helped Victoria make new cushions for the worn furniture. "You're nesting," Lily said one day, watching Victoria arrange wildflowers in a vase. "When is he going to make an honest woman of you?" Victoria blushed. "We haven't discussed marriage yet." "Why not? It's only been 6 weeks." "And Maddox is cautious about commitment." Lily snorted. "That man is about as uncommitted as the sun rising. Everyone in town can see he's head over heels. He's just too stubborn to say it out loud." But that evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch watching the sunset, Maddox proved Lily wrong. "Victoria," he said suddenly, "how would you feel about getting married?" She turned to look at him, startled by the abruptness. "In general, or are you asking me something specific?" "I'm asking you something specific." He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles. "I know it hasn't been long. I know I should probably wait longer, court you properly, but I don't see the point in waiting when I already know what I want." "And what do you want?" "You, as my wife. As my partner. As the person I come home to every night for the rest of my life." He turned to face her fully. "I love you, Victoria. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stood up to that outlaw over your mother's locket. I know I can't offer you luxury or a life free of worry. but I can offer you honesty and loyalty and all the love I have in me." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Maddox, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "Think about it. Make sure it's what you want." "I don't need to think about it," Victoria said. "I love you too. Of course I'll marry you." Maddox's face broke into a smile so bright it could have lit the entire town. He pulled a small box from his pocket. "I was hoping you'd say that." Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing extravagant but beautiful in its simplicity. "It was my grandmother's," Maddox said as he slipped it onto her finger. "The only thing I have left from before the war. I've been carrying it around for 2 weeks, waiting for the courage to ask." Victoria threw her arms around him, kissing him thoroughly. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and laughing, the sun had set completely, painting the sky in shades of purple and pink. "When?" Victoria asked. "Whenever you want. Tomorrow, if you like," Victoria laughed. "Let's give it at least a week." "I need time to make a dress, and we should tell people properly." "A week," Maddox agreed. "I can wait a week." The news spread through town rapidly, and this time the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Even Mrs. Henderson unbent enough to offer congratulations. Thomas sent a note expressing his happiness for them both and offering the loan of his cottage garden for the ceremony. They were married the following Saturday by Reverend Morrison, in a simple ceremony with the whole town in attendance. Victoria wore a dress she had sewn herself, pale blue with white lace, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Maddox had picked that morning. Maddox wore his best suit, his marshal's badge pinned to his vest. When he saw Victoria walking toward him, his eyes went suspiciously bright. The ceremony was short and sweet. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Maddox kissed Victoria with such tender passion that several of the ladies in attendance needed to fan themselves. The reception at the hotel was joyful, with food and music and dancing. Even the townspeople who had been skeptical were won over by the obvious love between the newlyweds. Thomas himself came and shook Maddox's hand, giving Victoria a brotherly kiss on the cheek. "Be happy," he told them both. "You deserve it." As the sun set, Maddox swept Victoria into a dance, holding her close as they swayed to the music. "Happy, Mrs. Abbott?" he asked softly. "Incredibly," Victoria said. "You, more than I ever thought possible." That night, in the house that was now truly theirs, Maddox carried Victoria over the threshold. They made love slowly, tenderly, discovering each other with wonder and joy. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Victoria felt a peace she had never known. "I still can't believe you're mine," Maddox whispered against her hair. "Believe it," Victoria said. "I'm not going anywhere." The early months of their marriage were blissful. They settled into a comfortable routine, learning each other's habits and preferences. Maddox learned that Victoria was cheerful in the mornings while he was grumpy until his second cup of coffee. Victoria learned that Maddox talked in his sleep when he was troubled, and that sometimes he needed silence and space to work through difficult cases. But there were also challenges. 3 months after the wedding, Maddox had to ride out after a gang that had robbed a freight wagon. He was gone for 5 days, and Victoria spent every one of them fighting panic. When he finally returned, sporting a bullet graze across his ribs, Victoria alternated between relief and fury. "You could have been killed," she shouted, even as she carefully cleaned and bandaged the wound. "I wasn't," Maddox said, wincing as she applied salve with perhaps more vigor than necessary. "You could have been. This is exactly what I was afraid of. You said you understood the risks." "Understanding them and living with them are 2 different things." Victoria's hands trembled. "Maddox, when you didn't come home yesterday, when you were a full day late, I thought—" Her voice broke. Maddox pulled her into his arms, mindful of his injured ribs. "I know. I'm sorry. We ran into trouble crossing the Picos. I sent word with a rancher heading this way, but he must have taken a different route." Victoria buried her face in his chest. "I love you so much. The thought of losing you is unbearable." "You're not going to lose me," Maddox said firmly. "I'm too stubborn to die, and I have too much to come home to." Over time, they learned to navigate these moments. Maddox became better about sending word when he would be delayed. Victoria learned to channel her fear into action, keeping busy with her work and with managing their home. They both learned to treasure the quiet moments between crises, to find joy in ordinary days. A year into their marriage, Victoria realized she was pregnant. She told Maddox over dinner one evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Really? We're going to have a baby, really," Victoria confirmed. "Are you happy?" Maddox came around the table and pulled her into his arms. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, yes, but happier than I've ever been." The pregnancy was difficult at times. Victoria suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months. Maddox hovered anxiously, driving her half crazy with his concern. But she also found his protectiveness touching. As her belly grew, Maddox became even more careful about his work. He took fewer risks, delegated more to his deputies. He wanted to be there for the birth, he told Victoria. Wanted to meet his child. Their son was born on a cool October evening in 1879, after 12 hours of labor that left Victoria exhausted and Maddox pale from worry. But when the doctor placed the squalling infant in Maddox's arms, all the fear melted away. "He's perfect," Maddox breathed, staring down at the red-faced baby with wonder. They named him Matthew after Maddox's father who had died in the war. Little Matthew had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, and from the moment he was born, he owned both their hearts completely. Parenthood changed them both. Maddox became even more determined to make Montezuma safe, working tirelessly to bring order to the territory. Victoria found reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, managing their home and their son while continuing her work with Mrs. O'Malley part-time. When Matthew was 6 months old, news came that the Donovan gang had finally been captured in Arizona territory. Jack Donovan himself was killed in the shootout along with several of his men. The rest were arrested. "It's over," Maddox said that evening, holding his son while Victoria prepared dinner. "The territory's getting more settled. The wild days are ending." "Is that good or bad?" Victoria asked. "Good," Maddox said firmly. "I want Matthew to grow up in a place where law and order mean something, where people can build lives without fear." 2 years later, their daughter was born. They named her Margaret after Victoria's mother. She had Maddox's gray eyes and Victoria's auburn hair, and she was a force of nature from the moment she drew breath. As the children grew, Montezuma grew too. More families moved in. The railroad came through, connecting them more firmly to the wider world. The town got a proper school, and both Matthew and Margaret attended, learning their letters and numbers. Maddox eventually became the county sheriff, a position with more authority and, thankfully, less danger. He could stay closer to home more often, which he preferred now that he had children who needed him. Victoria expanded her work with Mrs. O'Malley, eventually becoming a partner in the dress shop. She also became active in the town's social life, helping to establish the library Lily Chen had long advocated for. Through it all, their love deepened and strengthened. They had their arguments, of course. Maddox could still be stubborn and overprotective. Victoria could be equally stubborn and sometimes reckless in her determination to help others. But they always found their way back to each other, always remembered what mattered most. On their 10th anniversary, Maddox took Victoria back to the canyon where she had first told him she loved him. The children stayed with Lily and her husband, giving them rare time alone. They sat by the river as the sun set, just as they had that night so long ago. "You ever regret it?" Maddox asked. "Choosing this life instead of the safe one Thomas could have given you?" Victoria looked at him in surprise. "Not for a single moment, do you?" "No, but sometimes I wonder if you would have been happier with more stability, more certainty." Victoria took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Maddox, you've given me everything that matters. Love, partnership, a family, a home. The fact that our life has had some uncertainty along the way doesn't diminish any of that. If anything, it makes me appreciate it more." "I love you," Maddox said, pulling her close. "Just as much as I did the day I married you. More even." "I love you too," Victoria said. "Always have, always will." They sat there as the light faded, talking about their children, their work, their dreams for the future. Matthew wanted to be a doctor, inspired by Dr. Pierce. Margaret wanted to be a teacher like Miss Parsons, who had recently retired. "We're building something good here," Victoria said. "Not just our family, but this whole town. It's becoming the kind of place where people can build real lives." "Because of people like you," Maddox said. "You and Lily and Mrs. O'Malley and all the others who refuse to let the frontier stay wild." "And people like you," Victoria countered, "who made it safe enough for civilization to take root." As they rode back to town under the stars, Victoria thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 3 years ago, planning to marry a man she had never met. That woman could never have imagined how much her life would change, how much she would change. The years continued to pass peacefully. Matthew did become a doctor, studying in Santa Fe before returning to Montezuma to take over Dr. Pierce's practice. Margaret became a teacher, though she shocked everyone by also insisting on learning to shoot and ride like her father, declaring that Western women needed to be practical. Maddox eventually retired from law enforcement at 50, deciding he had spent enough years in danger. He became a part-time deputy only, helping train younger lawmen while spending more time with Victoria and, eventually, their grandchildren. Victoria ran the dress shop until her 60s, then sold it to a young woman from Denver and devoted herself to her growing family and her work with the library. Through it all, through the children and grandchildren, through the quiet years and the difficult ones, through sickness and health and all the ordinary moments of life, Victoria and Maddox remained devoted to each other. On their 50th anniversary, the whole town turned out for a celebration. Matthew and Margaret organized it, inviting everyone who had been part of their parents' story. Thomas Whitmore came, now married himself with grown children. Lily Chen was there, spry and sharp-tongued at 75. Even Mrs. Henderson attended, finally admitting that perhaps Victoria had made the right choice after all. The celebration was held in the town square, with tables of food and a small band playing. As the sun set, Maddox led Victoria onto the makeshift dance floor, and they swayed together as they had on their wedding night 50 years before. 50 years, Victoria marveled. "Where did the time go?" "Right here," Maddox said, holding her close. "Every moment right here with you. I wouldn't change a single day." Victoria looked up at the man she had loved for half a century. His hair was white now, his face lined with age, but his eyes still held that same intensity, that same love. "Neither would I," she said. "Not a single day." As they danced, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, by the town they had helped build, by the life they had created together, Victoria thought about fate and choice. She had come to Montezuma to marry one man and had found love with another. She had been frightened and uncertain, brave and determined, foolish and wise. But most of all, she had been lucky. Lucky that Maddox had been tracking outlaws that day. Lucky that she had been brave enough to speak her heart. Lucky that they had both chosen love over fear. The music played on, and they danced until the stars came out. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that lasted a lifetime. Years later, when Victoria was 82 and Maddox 84, they sat on the porch of their home on a warm summer evening. The house had been added onto over the years, expanded to accommodate visiting children and grandchildren. The garden Victoria had planted so long ago was now mature and lush. They sat in companionable silence, holding hands as they had for over 50 years. Matthew was inside with his wife and children, visiting for the weekend. Margaret was expected tomorrow with her family. "You remember that first day?" Victoria asked suddenly. "When you rode in shooting and saved us all from the Donovan gang?" Maddox smiled. "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I had ever seen, standing up to armed men over a locket. I remember thinking you were the most handsome man I had ever seen," Victoria said, "even covered in trail dust. You hid it well. You barely looked at me." "Because I was promised to Thomas. I was trying very hard to be proper," Victoria laughed. "I failed miserably." "Thank God for that," Maddox said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Thank God you were brave enough to follow your heart." "Thank God you were brave enough to let me in," Victoria countered. They sat quietly as the sun set, painting the New Mexico sky in brilliant colors. They had seen thousands of sunsets from this porch, each one different, each one beautiful. "I love you," Maddox said, as he had said thousands of times before. "I love you too," Victoria replied, as she always had and always would. Inside, they could hear their grandchildren laughing, could smell dinner cooking, could feel the warmth and life of their family surrounding them. This was what they had built together. Not just a house, but a home. Not just a family, but a legacy. When Maddox passed peacefully in his sleep at 86, with Victoria holding his hand, she grieved deeply. But she also celebrated the incredible gift of their 54 years together. She had loved him every day of their marriage and would love him every day for the rest of her life. Victoria lived another 4 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling stories of the old days, of cowboys and outlaws and frontier justice. She told them about the day a handsome marshal had saved her from bandits and, without meaning to, had stolen her heart. She passed quietly in the spring, at 88, with Matthew and Margaret at her bedside. Her last words were simple: "Tell your father I'm coming home." They buried her next to Maddox in the Montezuma Cemetery, under the wide New Mexico sky they had both loved. Their graves sat side by side, as they had sat side by side through life, two souls who had found each other against all odds. On their shared headstone, Matthew and Margaret had inscribed words that said it all. "Together in life, together in death, together forever. True love never ends." And in Montezuma, for generations afterward, people told the story of the marshal who had saved a woman from a stagecoach robbery, and the brave woman who had chosen love over security, adventure over safety, and a life fully lived over a life merely endured. They had built something beautiful together, something that lasted long after they were gone. Their love story became part of the town's history, a reminder that the best things in life are worth taking risks for, that love is always braver than fear, and that happy endings are real for those courageous enough to fight for them.